Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all as we start season 29 of the History Network podcast. Special shout outs to new patrons who have joined us over the intervening weeks: Ken Ingram, Mark Simmons and B. Koneke. I hope I pronounced all of those right. If not, let me know. And if you'd like to become a patron, then you can simply go to patreon.com/the History Network and find out about our Patreon setup there. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 29, episode 1, the Lewis and Clark Air Rifle. This episode was written by Doug Nipple. As any regulars of you will know, Doug has written for us before, and he is a high school physics teacher who lives a few miles outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Growing up in one of the major areas of early American history, it was only a matter of time before he became obsessively interested in it. Thanks for the script, Doug. The American West contains many epic tales and stories. Perhaps the most astounding is the story of Lewis and Clark and the Corp of Discovery. Over the course of 17 months, a group of over 40 individuals travelled 7,000 miles through hostile native tribes from the middle of America through previously unexplored mountain ranges to the Pacific Ocean, and returned healthy and well with only one casualty. Were they lucky? Were they superbly trained soldiers, or did they have some other kind of edge? The roots of the Lewis and Clark expedition began in 1801 as Spain ceded the territory now known as the Louisiana Purchase to France. France now controlled an extremely large area of the continent bordering the United States. Napoleon Bonaparte's aggressive tendencies caused many in the American government to fear that French forces at some point may contest the use of the Mississippi River and the American westward expansion. President Jefferson had directed his minister to France to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans to gain some control of navigation in the area. Instead of just New Orleans, the French offered to sail the entire Louisiana Purchase area, 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico north to Minnesota and Montana and west to Wyoming and Colorado. Driving this offer was Napoleon's need to raise funds to help deal with a possible impending war with England and to help with the economic damage of a recent slave rebellion in Haiti. With the 1803 purchase, the United States essentially doubled their landmass for $15 million. This amounts to about 3 cents an acre. At the beginning of 1803, President Thomas Jefferson approached the United States Congress and requested funding for an expedition to explore the massive new land purchase. Congress approved the request, and Jefferson appointed his personal secretary at the time, Army Lieutenant Meriwether Lewis, to lead the expedition. On July the 4th, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was announced to the public. The main objective of the mission was to map the waterways and the land. Jefferson also included orders to record everything about the native peoples, vegetation, animals, and climate. Where possible, they were to gather and send back samples. The expedition was named the Corp of Discovery. To begin preparing for the expedition, Jefferson sent Lewis to Philadelphia to purchase supplies and to be tutored in the sciences so that he could record observations and gather specimens as he explored the newly purchased lands. Philadelphia at the time was home to many of the scientists and doctors whom Jefferson knew and enlisted to assist Lewis in his preparations. Philadelphia was also home to some of the best craftsmen and artisans in America at the time. After his time in Philadelphia, Lewis travelled to Harper's Ferry in what is now currently West Virginia, where the United States Armory and Arsenal was located, and procured weapons and supplies. He then moved to Pittsburgh to oversee construction of a keelboat that was used to move upriver for the first part of the expedition. At the end of August, Lewis and a small group of men set off down the Ohio River to meet William Clark and the rest of the expedition in Louisville, Kentucky. A few weeks later, they set up winter camp in St. Louis and finalised their supplies and crew. Lewis appointed Clark to be his co-leader for the trip at this time. When winter broke in 1804, the expedition moved up the Missouri River with over 40 soldiers and crew members. A few months later, they began to encounter little-known Native American tribes in Iowa. Lewis held councils and distributed gifts to the tribes. During this time, the only member of the expedition to die did so from a burst appendix. By October, Lewis and Clark were in present-day North Dakota in the large village of the Mandan tribe. This village had a population of nearly 5,000, more than the city of St. Louis at the time. A fort was constructed for winter quarters near the friendly Mandan village. At that time, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French trapper who was wintering with the natives in the area, was acquired as a guide. Charbonneau's Shoshone wife, Sakagawe, would also accompany the expedition. April 1805, and the expedition sent the keelboat back to St. Louis and moved forward in canoes. They saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time, experienced difficult portages and dangerous terrain. No one in the expedition had ever seen mountains of this size. As they continued on, the travel became even more difficult. By August, things were dire. The group needed to make it through the mountains before the worst of the winter set in, and they weren't moving fast enough. At this time, the expedition encountered a group of Shoshone. These Shoshone happened to be from Sakagawe's tribe. Her brother was one of the tribe's chiefs, and Sakagawe was able to negotiate for Lewis and Clark to obtain horses, which enabled them to move quickly over the mountains. The Shoshone also provided a guide to move them safely through the Rockies. With their newly acquired horses and guide, the expedition safely reached the Pacific Ocean in November and voted to set up a winter camp and return after the worst of the weather had passed. They constructed a small outpost called Fort Clatsop near the Columbia River between the present states of Oregon and Washington. In spring, the expedition began the return journey. After recrossing the Rocky Mountains, the expedition split into two groups so that more land was able to be explored. Clark moved down the Yellowstone River and Lewis returned by the Missouri River. After the expedition split in July of 1806, the Lewis group had their first and only violent encounter with natives on the journey. A group of Blackfeet attacked the group. 2 of the 8 Blackfeet were killed. No one in Lewis's party was harmed. In August, the two groups reunited, and in September they returned to St. Louis, ending a 7,000-mile journey with no losses to violence. Even more astounding, there was only one small-scale skirmish. How was it possible that the expedition travelled that far through mostly hostile territory and not suffer any losses? The answer may be a specialised and little-known weapon that was carried by Meriwether Lewis, the Girandoni Air Rifle. Sometime in 1779 to 1780, an Austrian gunsmith named Bartolomeo Girandoni created the Windbush, or wind rifle. This is possibly the first repeating rifle and was powered by a canister of compressed air. The rifle had an effective range of about 150 yards with a full air canister and was capable of rapidly firing 20 to 30.46 rounds. The reusable steel air canister, which was the butt of the rifle, would be good for the 30 rounds. 2 spare air canisters were issued with the rifle. It would take around 1,500 to 2,000 pumps to refill an air tank from a hand pump that resembles a bike pump. The rifle was approximately the same size and weight of most contemporary muskets. Over 1,500 Girandoni rifles were issued to units in the Austrian army over 3 decades, starting in 1780. The rifle had many positive attributes, including a fast rate of fire with a smokeless and near soundless discharge. There were also several negatives, including the extended period of time to refill the air canisters and the delicate nature of the mechanisms. The gaskets for the rifle were made from leather and had to be kept moist to hold seals airtight. At least one of the Girandoni Air Rifles made its way over the Atlantic to the American continent. It is believed Meriwether Lewis acquired it at Lucan's shop in Philadelphia as he was purchasing supplies and being trained as a naturalist for the expedition. The Lucan shop was run by a father and son, Seneca and Isaiah Lucan. They were the premier craftsmen in the city, expert gunsmiths, watchmakers and builders of scientific instruments. The younger Lucan, Isaiah, was even a member of Ben Franklin's American Philosophical Society. Even though there is no record in the journals or the writings of Lewis and Clark of where Lewis actually procured the air rifle, it would be logical to assume that since Lewis was in town to procure, among other things, scientific instruments, that the Lucans would have been one of his stops. The Lucans were also known to construct their own air rifles. However, the Lucan models were all single-shot. Even though it has never been directly stated that Lewis's airgun was a Girandoni, there are many historical accounts that evidently point to that fact. The first account was one of the first entries in the expedition journal of Lewis. He was leaving Pittsburgh after waiting for the construction of a keelboat for the expedition. The site of the boatmaker's shop is near what is now Pittsburgh Convention Center on the Allegheny River. Lewis and some men from his crew stopped at Brunock Island on the Ohio River, just upriver from the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers merge to the Ohio River. It is recorded that Lewis demonstrated an air rifle for a small group that had invited him to stop on the populated island, and he then allowed some of the men living on the island to fire the weapon. Unfortunately, the shooter was not familiar with the operation of the air rifle and put a ball through the hat of a woman downrange, scraping her head with the shot. After recovering from the shock of the incident, she seemed well. The account specifies that several rounds were fired quickly. The next account of the use of the rifle occurs a few days later when Lewis and his crew were in Wheeling, Virginia, further down the Ohio River. A judge, Colonel Rodney, encountered Lewis and spent some time with him. During that time, Lewis demonstrated the air rifle for him, and Rodney wrote of the event in his diary. He was impressed and recorded the gun could fire 22 times in 1 minute, describing distinctive features that seemed to confirm it as a Girandoni rifle. Other records exist outside of the Lewis and Clark journals that describe the air rifle and its effects on the natives that observed it. One record in particular is that of Charles McKenzie, an employee of a trading company who was spending the winter in the Native American Hidatsa village with the Lewis and Clark expedition. He recorded his observations of the air rifle, stating that it could fire multiple rounds repeatedly and that the Indians admired the air gun but dreaded the magic of the owners. This seems to fit with the narrative that Lewis and the expedition leveraged the psychological power of the weapon to minimize confrontation. Further actual Lewis and Clark journal entries confirm this. Several of them mention Lewis and Clark bragging of the abilities of the gun and stressing that they never let the natives see the gun run out of ammunition or let them see that there was only one of them. One instance in the journal spoke of an encounter with a group of Sioux that the expedition feared were setting up for an attack. Lewis then showed them the airgun, demonstrated its capabilities, at which point the Sioux left the area. Another mention was in 1806 as the group was on the way back on the Columbia River. Another group of natives was harassing the expedition when Lewis again demonstrated the airgun. Clark recorded that after this they were orderly and kept a proper distance. The air rifle was such a pivotal part of the expedition that it was mentioned almost 40 times in the journal entries, but the weapon and any other mention of it disappears at the end of 1806 after the expedition had returned to St. Louis. Almost 200 years later, in 2005, a pair of Master Museum gunsmiths asked a private collector to examine and use his authentic Girandoni Air Rifle as a model to recreate several replicas from. During their study, they became convinced that the rifle they were working with was, in fact, the actual rifle carried by Lewis during the expedition. They compared notes made on the air rifle and its repairs and nuances that were made in the journals and elsewhere, and concluded, with the concurrence of several other historians, that the rifle they had in their possession was in fact the one carried for over 7,000 miles by Meriwether Lewis. The private owner donated the rifle to the Army Heritage and Educational Center of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where it is located today. Well, thanks once again, Doug, for that script. A great one, again, from you. If you'd like to write a script for us, just drop us a line at info@thehistorynetwork.org. Or if you'd like to hear a podcast on a subject that you think we may not have covered before, then again, just drop us a line and we'll look into it for you. Once again, if you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to patreon.com/The History Network. And that just leaves me to thank you all again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Doug Nipple, read by Nick Barker.